So class, we already know various literary elements both from poetry and fiction, but still many folks get a little uneasy when they have to analyze a poem. They don't know where to start. Well, don't fret, I'll help you with the art of explication. In this lecture, we will break down the ways to examine the detailed language of a short passage, whether it be poetry or drama or fiction. You will be able to amaze and dazzle your friends with your interpretive abilities. With this lecture, you will have strategies to combine elements of figurative language, form, and sound. At this point in the program, please remove yourself from all distractions. Make sure you have a pen and a pad of paper to take notes during the presentation. If I go too quickly, please feel free to stop and rewind as often as you need to. Enjoy! To explicate a text is to patiently unfold the subtle meanings in it line by line, and sometimes word by word, dwelling on details a casual reader might miss, and illustrating how a work's smaller parts contribute to the whole. Typically, this whole is your paper that is working to some single, cohesive argument about an interpretive possibility in the poem. By breaking the poem into its elements, whether they are elements of sound, form, or style, you will see how the components lend to the entire interpretation and experience of a poem. Think of it as a sort of reverse engineering. You break the whole into parts to see how it is put together. Sometimes we make this a step-by-step process, like the throwing star directions above. But when analyzing a poem, you aren't nearly as likely to put an eye out. So that's a good thing. The first step in explication is to orient yourself as to what is happening in the poem. It is best to ask a couple diagnostic questions. Please remember, the answer to these questions isn't yet analysis. These aren't even interesting questions exactly. But if we remember from the other lectures, it is best to know the basic facts of something so we don't waste our time interpreting things that are already given. The answers to these questions lead to the better questions. Is the poem a narrative poem, a lyric poem, a dramatic monologue? Is there any implied narrative? Does the poem have a specific speaker or voice? Who is it? What are the hints? Is the poem in a particular form? Is there a rhyme? Consistent or inconsistent? What are some recurring themes or images in the poem? Once you have run your basic diagnostic, you will need to start digging into some of the figurative language of the poem. Often papers don't get past the figurative language because showing comparisons and connections between unlike things has a lot of potential for both interpretation and tone. The nature of the comparison and its social connotations bring up many difficult questions for you to both ask and answer. Remember, when you discuss these connections, it will take you a couple sentences, because it is complicated. If you have dealt with a line or image of poetry in a brief sentence, you probably did nothing more than summarize the passage. Discuss the effect of these various sounds and connections in a poem. Explication is all about the connections language makes to meaning in a text. It is your job as a student and an academic to ask what the nature of that relationship is and why that relationship is important. Remember, don't be happy with simple answers to the questions you ask, or ask better questions. Since you are busy and sometimes have to get straight to the explications, there are a couple strategies that will save you some time and make the most of your intellectual energies. Keep in mind, explication tends to be a way to examine short poems or short passages from longer poems. This means you either pick a shorter poem to analyze, or that you will narrow your focus to specific elements and what they suggest about the specific theme in the longer poem. Of course, the longer the paper length requirement, the more literary elements you will weave into your paper. Once you have decided on a general focus, consider what most stands out for you in the poem. Trust that these parts are important and telling of an overall theme. Typically, if you notice a poetic element like alliteration or personification, or metaphor immediately, it is an important aspect to the poem. Two things I will advise, though. First, don't take these obvious elements at face value. Dig a little deeper so you are not dealing with obvious content. Most folks don't need too much help in realizing a rose is a symbol for love. You need to dig a little deeper than that. 2. If you are looking at obvious symbols or metaphors or whatevers, also look for less obvious elements and how they add another layer of understanding or feeling to the passage. Of course, you will describe and explain what those other layers are. So, if you are looking to explicate a poem or just understand it on a more complete level, you might approach it with a strategy in mind. Step 1. Read the poem with a general attention to its mood and your overall reaction. Don't write anything down just yet. Just feel. Step 2. Reread the poem underlining passages that still make you react. Think of yourself as a living EEG machine, marking the lively moments of a poem. These are your gut reactions. Trust them, but don't trust them too much yet. Step 3. Reread the passage and underline images, words, and phrases that maintain your attention. Look for obvious literary elements that pop out at you. Once you have all the parts you like and a relatively solid surface interpretation of the poem, read it a 4th time, underlining any passages that might complicate or contradict your interpretation. Think outside of your personal interpretation and in a specific way consider how others might interpret the poem differently. Note: if you are too general or glib about these other possible interpretations, it will sound very, very bad. Instead, consider these alternate interpretations as ways to complicate your interpretations. How do you explain the contradiction? Why would the poet do that? Remember, it's very complicated, so don't simplify things that are complex. When approaching a poem for explication, the general order is to go chronologically through the poem, often stanza by stanza. But please remember, you do not have to account for every line in the poem, so only focus on the phrases that seem the most loaded or significant to your interpretation. You will be looking for multiple literary elements in the same passage, which will work to show the passage's complexity. You will be amazed at what you discover about the poem looking at it this way. Once you start looking at the complexity of language and image, you will be able to write as much as you need about any good poem. Typically, you do not want to divide your analysis by the different literary elements. This leads to papers with a paragraph on alliteration, one on metaphor, and so on. This format is less likely to show the connections between different literary elements and how they work to create an entire poem. These are generally less productive organizational patterns. So let's go through the super short poem by Randall Jarrell for some explication practice. So, first listen along as I read the following poem, noting your various reactions, confusions and all. Death of the ball turret gunner. From my mother's sleep I fell into the state, and hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. So when I start thinking of my initial reaction, some things don't really make sense. That is okay. I am not married to any interpretation yet. Think of this as an eye exam. Interpretations tend to go from blurry to clear. So, first I had a mind-bending confusion. How do I fall from my mother's sleep? Second, the wet fur reminded me of a baby seal falling from the sky. Is this poem about baby seals? Of course not. This doesn't quite make sense yet. It is just an impression. The last one of afterbirth, again, may seem strange, but it is important to keep these impressions in mind as we look for the rational meaning behind the poem. I think the important point of my impression, ultimately, is that the tone is very serious and very critical of this here state this speaker fell into in the first line. Next, I underlined a couple passages that got my attention and seemed like hints as to the surface meaning of the poem. In the first underlined phrase, since state is capitalized, it seems to represent some sort of government authority. It isn't quite a dictatorship, but it does connote military rule. The idea of wet fur suggests two things. First, that the speaker is young and wet behind the ears, and that it is wet and cold in the speaker's environment. Perhaps ideal for a seal, but not a young human. The next phrase confuses me, but got my attention. I think because of the sound. Nightmare fighters seems to imply some horrible opposition that makes the speaker frantic and fearful like a nightmare. This seems like a war scene. The last line is again a graphic, gross image of a human being blown to pieces. Why would the speaker end on such a negative image about war? What does it suggest about the speaker? What does it suggest that the speaker was dead the entire time? How does that change the entire poem? The parts I've marked in red complicate my initial reaction in basic interpretation. These may be difficult parts to make fit, but do not ignore these parts. They are the aspects of the poem that, when discussed, add a nice multi-layered complexity in your analysis. So you may still be asking, Mr. Seeger, what is this thing you call a ball turret gunner? I'm glad you asked. Look it up. I think I said it before, but Google is a heck of a thing. Okay, for the sake of this lecture, I will fill you in. A ball turret gunner was a soldier during World War II who fired the gun which was in a turret on the underbelly of the plane. Obviously, there was a little protection from the elements or from enemy fire. Sometimes, if the landing gear didn't deploy, the ball turret gunner would get crushed. Now most poems have quite a bit of wiggle room for interpretation, but they all have a couple basic facts you can't mess with. This poem cannot be about a rural farming accident. That's just silly. We don't have to consider the author's intent necessarily, but if the author makes a point of reference obvious, we have to oblige them in our analysis. So here are the facts. 1. It is a poem about World War II. 2. It is also about birth and mothers, those people who typically care for us most. Thirdly, the speaker is dead in the last line. Why the Shyamalan-esque twist? Why wait until the last line? Why does that change about the rest of the poem? Also, consider that the speaker leaves Earth 2 different times. The speaker is also born at least twice in the poem. Once in the first line. He did fall from his mother. And he leaves the ball turret, which looks like a womb and is referred to as a belly. So all these facts are starting to come together. Remember, they are not legitimate analysis yet, but we are starting to see some interesting connections. But we still have to draw those connections and discuss them thoroughly. So now that I have a general feel for the poem and a basic logical understanding of it, I'm ready to read it again, looking for various poetic elements. I start with any formal concerns, and then pay attention to the figurative language before examining elements of sound. Part of this process is to more deliberately identify poetic elements in order to more clearly understand their effect on the entire poem and the reader, also known as you. Part of this practice is to focus your attention to key passages of a poem and think about their significance. Another part is to generally clarify your thinking, observations, and the points you are making in your paper. Remember the optometrist metaphor. You may have to try alternate interpretations until the poem comes into focus for you. Is this clearer, or is this clearer? How about now? How about now? Once you have found some of the flashier elements like symbols and personification and such, remember, it is also helpful to consider the sounds of a poem. Sounds, as we all know, are a great way of determining a poem's tone and attitude to the subject. Think of your favorite music. Don't you make your strongest emotional connection to the sounds of the song? This is also true to a lesser extent in a poem. Consider the various sounds of the poem, and only the sounds, knowing what you already know about the poem. How does the sound highlight what you already know? Where does the sound get your attention? Why? What is the very specific effect of the sound on the speaker? What does it draw attention to? Remember, elements of sound typically need to be connected to another element of the poem, like tone or theme. Or it might draw attention to various bits of key language. Listen to the poem one more time. Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. From my mother's sleep I fell into the state, and hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to the black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Once you start looking at details in a poem, you will start noticing patterns or images or implications you didn't notice before. Let yourself make silly interpretations, but be aware when they are silly interpretations. One thing I began noticing in this poem as I looked for figurative language and elements of sound were the pronouns. The state is referred to as it throughout the poem, but in the last line, the ones washing the speaker out of the turret are they. This they is a little innocuous. They seem to be servants of the state, or the state's other children, which brings up many interesting psychological implications. But I think the various progressions in this poem are telling. The pronouns, the symbol of the turret, the harshness of the sounds up until the last line, all these things create relationships between images and concepts, between poem and history, between poem and reader. Now hypothetically, say you want to do a detailed explication of a much longer text, either a paragraph or two from a story, a soliloquy from Shakespeare, or just a poem that is a couple pages long. The basic premises for explication are the same no matter what genre you're working in. First, it is implied that you are not taking the passage you explicate out of the context of the larger work. This means you need to know the entire work and give a brief summary of it, most likely in your introduction, in order to place the passage on solid ground. You don't want to give too much summary of the entire work, but you should ground the reader. Think Netflix descriptions of movies, or TiVo descriptions of individual television episodes. Write a summary like that, without the corporate fear of spoilers. Don't ever worry about revealing the secret ending or twist or mystery of a literary work. That is exactly what you are here to do. That's your job. Once you give the brief summary of your poem, you will focus some of your analysis on its significance to the entire work. This may be the focus of your analysis, or it could be something you deal with in the introduction to ground the reader in the central thesis or argument of your paper. And yes, even explication papers are making an argument. The general argument of your paper will be some version of this: my interpretation is insightful and legitimate. Of course, the trick is to make an assertion that is arguable and not merely personal opinion. The other option for explicating a longer poem or a mid-sized poem is to focus on 2 or 3 key elements. This will allow you to cast your laser-like focus on only a couple aspects of the poem: allusions, or symbols, or diction, or a certain type of imagery, and so on. Note: you want to qualify terms like diction and imagery. All poets use these things. What type of diction? Simple diction, informal diction, slang, and what kind of imagery? Birthing imagery, war imagery, food imagery, nature imagery. There are so many questions you should be asking right now. So now that we have gone over various strategies to explicate various types of poems, it is time to start replicating this process with the poem you want to examine on your own. Ask good probing questions, and please don't mistake summarizing a poem with explicating it. Some poems, especially older poems like Shakespearean sonnets, need a level of basic interpretation. That is an extra step in the interpretive process, not interpretation itself. True quality explication or analysis looks at the various aspects of a poem and how they work together to make a complex whole. A lot of this is about identifying relationships between parts of the poem, the nature of those relationships, and what these relationships suggest about the real world, whether that world is physical, internal, or some combination of the two. Keep asking better questions. Write the questions down. Answer said questions. That's a good start. The other option for explicating a longer poem, or a mid-sized poem, is to focus on 2 or 3 key elements. This will allow you to cast your laser-like focus on only a couple aspects of the poem, allusions, or symbols, or diction, or a certain type of imagery, and so on. Important note: you want to qualify terms like diction and imagery. All poets use these things. What type of diction? Simple diction, informal diction, slang, and what kind of imagery? Birthing imagery, war imagery, food imagery, nature imagery. There are so many questions you should be asking right now. So now that we have gone over various strategies to explicate various types of poems, it is time to start replicating this process with the poem you want to examine. Ask good, probing questions, and please don't mistake summarizing a poem with explicating it. Some poems, especially older poems like Shakespearean sonnets, need a level of basic interpretation. This is an extra step in the interpretive process, not interpretation itself. True quality explication or analysis looks at the various aspects of a poem and how they work together to make a complex whole. A lot of this is about identifying relationships between parts of the poem, the nature of those relationships, and what these relationships suggest about the real world, whether that world is physical, internal, or some combination of the two. Keep asking better questions. Write the questions down. Answer said questions. That's a good start.